Okay, so welcome back to my channel. I want to first start off by apologizing if you hear any noise. It is Friday night, and so some of my neighbors are in the hallway. I have my neighbor upstairs, and I do have my window open because it's hot in here. So I just want to apologize in advance if any of those noises come across. Secondly, I want to apologize for not getting this recap up this morning. I got a little busy yesterday and just wasn't able to do it, so we're going to shoot for the 17th between 2 and 3 o'clock, so in the AM. So we're going to move on to my recap of Netflix The Haunting of Bly Manor, episode 8, The Romance of Certain Old Clothes. This is another episode I found interesting. I mean, unfortunately, of the 8 episodes that I've seen thus far, I would say 2 has been able to keep my attention all the way through, and this is by far one of them. So it picks up where episode 7 left off, with Dani now in the grips of the lady in the lake. And so this episode is basically the whole backstory of how these certain individuals that we've seen appear, their origin story and the history of the house. And so the house was originally owned by the Willoughby family. It opens with the father dying and the 2 daughters who are, just basically they're going, they're grieving at this point. And the oldest name is Viola and the youngest is named Perdita. And so, their father died, and of course, at this time, this is the 17th, it doesn't give an exact time, it just said mid-17th century, which would be the 1600s. During this time, women couldn't own property, they couldn't inherit property, everything that they had went to their husbands. And unfortunately, Mr. Willoughby did not have a son, and so now the daughters are trying to figure out how they can keep the property in the family. And so they... even though they had a number of suitors, Viola being the oldest, decided on a distant cousin named Arthur Lloyd. And so he turned out to be a pretty great guy initially, because she wanted to make this grand entrance. So she actually had Perdita, meet him as he arrived, and they seemed to hit it off. I mean, it seemed like they hit it off a little bit, and it almost seemed like Perdita was, she was kind of fancying him. But of course, Viola walks in and steals the show, and eventually they marry. Now, you could tell that, she didn't want to necessarily marry, but unfortunately, the conventions of the time dictated that she had to in order to keep their family home. And what you find is, and this is going to be a theme throughout the show, where initially when she got married, they made it a point to focus on the fact that she would sleep and that she would wake up and she would walk. She would sleep, she would wake up in the middle of the night and walk. Like, she was restless. It was just something in her spirit, that was just her thing. But what she found, which was kind of surprising, is that she did eventually grow to love Arthur. It wasn't, it grew to be more, and they did love each other. But the thing is, Perdita was always in the background, because before Arthur came, they were thick as thieves. It was them against the world. And, you can see Perdita kind of feeling displaced a little bit. And especially after their daughter Isabel was born, you could see Perdita, she didn't necessarily lose her sister, but her relationship with her sister changed. Unfortunately, Viola ends up getting sick, and this is actually before, I don't even think Isabel was 1 year old at this point. And the doctor said that she has the lung. So at this point, the plague was big, and at first they thought that that's what she had, but it wasn't. He said that she has the lung. I wonder if he was talking about like tuberculosis or something like that, which I'm assuming that's what he meant. What that meant. And so they are now, she hid it for a while, and he lavished her. She always had this appetite for like fancy clothes and jewelry and everything, and he was independently wealthy aside from whatever he inherited from the Willoughby estate. And so he, she lived quite well, and then it got to the point where she could no longer hide it. And then that's when, of course, they called the doctor in, and they gave them a diagnosis. He basically told them that they had to quarantine her, and that they had to reduce their amount of time around her, and they definitely had to keep Isabel, her daughter, from her around her, which obviously which is very difficult for her. And like, again, this whole time you can see Perdita kind of in the shadows, feeling like, okay, she's being pushed further and further away. And so then you see these treatments with the leeches, and how they used to, the bleeding, where they would, think that they could, the sickness was in the blood. If they took more blood, then I guess the person would be cured. This whole thing, and so, which looked like torture. And it got to the point where they called the priest to come and say the last rites, and he's telling her that she has to, in order for her soul to move to heaven, after she passed, he's telling her that she has to say these certain words, and she decided, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not leaving. And of course, her husband is saying, honey, this is not about your physical body anymore. This is about your soul, and I want your soul to go to heaven. And then Perdita goes over and is like, no, she doesn't have to say it if she doesn't want to. The Lord, he made her just as she is. And basically, Viola's been stubborn her whole life, so that was basically Perdita's thing. Like, she's not, she doesn't have to, and basically she's not going to. She'd already said no, she's not going to say it. And so at that point, it wasn't a whole lot they could do. And so the next thing you see, Isabel is like, at this point, 5 years old, and Perdita's telling her it's time for her to go to bed. And like children do, but when they don't want to go to bed, she wants to dance. And, her father indulged her and danced with her a little while. And then he asked Perdita to dance. And so they danced a little bit. And then you see Viola. Now, at this point, at least I was thinking that Viola had already passed away. She wasn't. Viola was just that stubborn. It's been 5 years with her dealing with TB. I don't know what the life expectancy of somebody during that time would have been dealing with that, but Viola was like, nope, I'm not leaving here until I'm getting ready. So then they see her. She's standing in the doorway, and she comes in, and Perdita stops her because she was going to go and she wanted to talk to Isabel, but of course they're really trying to keep Isabel away from her because they don't want her to get sick. Okay, so she ends up getting sick and falling to the ground, and of course Perdita's trying to help her. I don't know where she mustered that energy, but she ends up slapping the piss out of Perdita because she walked in. Perdita and Arthur was getting a little cozy, and she was not feeling that at all. And so you could see Isabel looking kind of scared, and she's, it was off-putting to her, obviously. And so Perdita get her back in bed, and she's telling Perdita, I can dance with my husband. I don't need you to do that or anything else. And so Perdita was like, it's not like that, I would never do that whole thing. And so that night, you can kind of see Viola kind of walking through the hall. She's singing. You can see her portrait there, just above the staircase. And then she makes her way to what used to be her room with her husband. Of course, his daughter's there. They just all cozy, and it seemed quite, he seemed quite happy. And of course, she's quite obviously it's difficult for her. I can't imagine what that would be like. You're newly married, you have this beautiful new child, and then you get sick, and then you can't really have any contact, not any real meaningful contact with this child, and it's just, even though you're watching her grow up, I don't know what that must have been torture for her, right? And so the next morning, you see Perdita. She's helping bathe her, and you can see Viola's like, oh, look at you, Lady of Bly Manor. And Perdita was like, I don't even want that title. And she started talking about Arthur, and she was like, the only reason Arthur looks at me is because he's lonely, and I'm basically because I'm here. And then they started talking a little bit, and Perdita said something to her, and she ended up trying to slap her again. And the next thing you know, you see all the the people, the maids and all that. They're bringing in all her dresses and her jewelry and all the stuff that she's acquired over the years. And you see Perdita just standing there watching them go into the room. And then you realize why they were doing that. She had this trunk, and she was putting all of her valuable possessions in this trunk, and she wanted to lock it away for Isabel when Isabel comes of age. This will be her inheritance. And so she made Arthur promise that he would lock it away, and he wouldn't give the key, he would hide the keys, whatever, and he wouldn't give it to anyone but Isabel. And he promised. Unfortunately, around this time, they were having some financial issues. And so he had ended up having to go away to take care of some things. And Perdita obviously was left to care for her sister. And she either initially you thought it was out of mercy, but the storyteller at this point, it was a lot of the storyteller voiceover and saying that it was really, you thought it was about mercy, but it wasn't. It was like Perdita basically had enough, and she killed her sister. And he honored what his wife wanted. He locked the trunk up. It had 3 locks, 3 different keys. And then you see him put it in an envelope, and he seals it and puts it in his desk. And the thing is, Perdita, while he was doing this, I don't know if he saw her, but she saw him where he put the keys to the trunk. And so as time went on, they threw some parties. They, felt like it would be appropriate for him to marry again. But at this point, he had only had eyes for Perdita, and she had always, had some feelings for him as well. And so they end up marrying in secret. And so then we go back. This is connecting, I forget which episode it was, where Flora was doing the rubbings inside the chapel. And I was like, well, why is it Viola Lloyd? So that's who the rubbing was for. And so they end up getting married. And they never had any children. So a couple of years had gone by. They didn't have any children. Isabel, her relationship with her aunt had changed. I guess she really didn't like the fact that she had married her dad. She felt, even though she never said anything, her behavior, she just wasn't, she wasn't feeling Auntie Perdita at this point. And so Perdita is walking through the halls, and as you can see in the corner there, Viola's picture looks kind of odd. And so Perdita got about halfway down the staircase and realized something, and then she turns, and of course you see the picture is just fine, and of course she has her own portrait right next to her sister's above the staircase. So at this point, they are not in the same financial situation they were when Viola was alive and when Arthur and Viola initially married. So he is not able to lavish, give her the type of lifestyle that Viola had, which is created a lot of jealousy and anger in her, because at this time she always felt like she was in Viola's shadow, and now she still feels like she's in Viola's shadow, even though she's lady of the manor at this point. And all these years, this trunk is there, and you can see Isabel there playing, and she eventually go to Arthur and say, we're having these financial troubles. The house needs repairs. We've had to let all of the help go, and even though we have all of this money that's just locked away in this trunk, and he basically said that he could not do it. And he doesn't want to upset her, but at the same time, he wants to keep the promise that he made to Viola, and that really angered her, because she felt like, okay, she's gone, I'm here, and we could use these things to help us, and you're refusing to do that. And it's like, I don't know, I'm torn between that, because at the end of the day, those were things that her mother left, and she was very specific. Like, she really drove home, like, this is for our daughter and her only, and she will be the only one that you give these keys to when she's of age. And he couldn't break that promise, which obviously infuriated Perdita. And so she, knowing where the keys were, went on up there, got the keys, crept on up to the attic. I don't know how much creeping she could have done, because she's still wearing the heels, and you can hear that thing hear them click clacking all through the house. So how they didn't hear that, okay, is anybody's guess. Anywho, So she opened the trunk and she's like, all, you know, her eyes are all aglow about all this jewelry and these fancy dresses and and then the next thing you know, this was like the jump scare. Probably like one of the only ones that I've seen. I don't know, maybe in a handful at this point, you know, throughout all the episodes, but this one is definitely one where, and all of a sudden she's holding up this dress and then these hands come out and next you know, her head snaps back and then it's daytime. Arthur is looking for Perdita. He's, you know, walking around the house. He makes his way to the attic and you can see his facial expression. He's seeing something. What is he seeing? Perdita is dead on the floor. And not only dead, it looked like she was scared to death, like she'd had a heart attack or something. I was like, okay, what could have possibly have caused that? Okay, so then we flash. They go back to the night that Viola died. And then she wakes up and you see the sheets over her with the flowers and the whole thing, the petals and everything. And so she's kind of confused, like, okay, what exactly is going on here? So she gets up, goes to the door. The door is locked. She goes to the windows. The windows are sealed as well. And she goes to the mirror. She looks at herself in the mirror, and then you see there's all this jewelry. And then you kind of realize, okay, her purgatory is like she's in the trunk with all of her riches, her gowns and her jewelry and all that. And so eventually she goes to the bed. She sleeps. She wakes up. It's the same thing. She sleeps. She wakes up. And she walks. So she goes to the door. She goes to the window. Then she goes to the wardrobe. And she sees her dresses and stuff. And then this time she pulls out a dress. And then she goes to the mirror. And then she sees she looks completely different. And she covers the mirror. And then eventually, you know, as time goes on, she resigns herself to the fact that she is in fact dead. She's come to terms with that. And at this point, she's now waiting for this trunk to open. Trunk opening means that the door to wherever this purgatory is going to open as well. And I was trying to figure out, like, what, okay, let me continue on. So she's now standing because her dream is that when the door does open, that she's going to see Isabel. But, you know, she hears the door, she hears the keys, she's looking at the door opens. Who walks through? Perdita. So she's standing there with all the anger and the venom you could have over, okay, this heifer then killed me, and now she's rummaging through my daughter's inheritance, like she's like scavenging for what now? No. And that's when her hands go around Perdita's neck. And not only was her hands around Perdita's neck, I mean, I don't know if she's just that strong at this point, or if she was just that angry, but you heard bones snap, crackle, and popping, which is probably why Perdita looked the way she did, because she probably broke every bone in that woman's neck, right? And then, you know, she stood up, and then she could hear footsteps, and that's when you see Arthur walk in looking for Perdita. And then she's now back in the trunk, or her purgatory. She sleeps, and, you know, goes through this whole process again. Sleeps, wakes up, walks, sleeps, wakes up. It's like, it's this whole thing. And then, you know, eventually they have to sell the house. They move, and, you know, this trunk. And so she's thinking, okay, they're going to pack up and take her with her, take this trunk, and she will still eventually be able to see her daughter at some point. And so she's like, you can kind of see her. She can hear the stuff that's going on. She can hear, you know, she can feel the movement of the trunk. But at this point, he thinks, after seeing how Perdita look, he thinks that this trunk is cursed or whatever the case may be. And he did not want to take that energy to wherever they were going because he was afraid for his daughter. And so what they did was they tossed the trunk in the lake, which is how she got into the lake. And so you can see her looking up, and you see them kind of looking down, seeing the trunk float to the bottom of the lake. And now this is where she spends the next, 4 centuries. And it's the same thing. She would sleep, she would wake, she would walk, and she would go to the house. Obviously, she would go to that same room, which was her daughter's room, looking for her daughter. And then she would do it all over again. And every time she would sleep, she would forget. And so she's like reliving this thing over and over again. And so throughout the years, you know, this eventually the plague did, you know, hit their village, and that house became a quarantine spot. So you see all these people lying around. She goes up to her daughter's room. There's actually a patient there. A doctor walks in and he's asking her why she's there. You know, you're not supposed to be here. This is quarantine. He's actually her first victim. She ends up killing him. He's now dead on the floor. You can see him kind of standing there looking at his body. And this is where it starts. And then the next person was a vicar. And the same thing. She would sleep. And the thing is, as time goes on and her memory starts to fade, so did her face. And so, this is how she ends up looking the way that she does. Unfortunately, we finally get the story of this little boy that Flora kept seeing. She was on one of her walks, and this child was she was looking for her child, and she did the whole thing of going to the room. This time there was an actual child there, obviously not her child, and unfortunately you see her, she's staring at this kid. I'm kind of confused, like this kid just was laying there staring at her, didn't scream or cry, anything, but unfortunately she ends up killing this kid and taking the kid back to the lake. Now I am glad that they showed it like this and not like how she was doing to other people, dragging them out. Nobody needed to see that, so I'm glad they didn't do that. And so what you saw is as she continued to fade, so too did the other people in the house. So obviously that was the first guy, which would have been the doctor, and then of course you see this kid now. And so just over time, and then you finally see Perdita. She who's actually the person, or was the person in the attic that Peter pulled down and said, the longer we stay here, we eventually looks like this. So she died in the attic, and in the attic is where she stayed all these centuries, right? And so then they fast forward to present day, which would be 87, 88 at this point, and where Peter was killed by her. And, you know, this has just been her routine all of these centuries. And so that is pretty much, you know, the story of Bly Manor and how some of these people came to be at this property and why they look the way they look. And so now Dani is in her grips, and it's like, okay, we got one more episode left. And this is pretty much how the episode ends. So like I said, this was like another, you know, unfortunately, it's basically, the second, maybe, you know, I would say 2.5 episodes. I don't know, but definitely this was by far one of the more interesting episodes this season. So I'm going to end this here, and I will talk to you guys later.